I might be a little bit of a madman for doing this video. So review family and newcomers to the channel, one thing that I have been asked numerous times whenever I am interacting with someone outside of this community and niche, someone in my friend circle, someone in a social circle that aren't familiar with this community and ask me what I do on YouTube, and I tell them, oftentimes boil down a lot of their opinions of heavy metal to only being one specific thing. They think it's all screamo, they associate a ton of terms with it, a ton of stereotypes with it, when in reality heavy metal cannot be boiled down to one thing and one thing alone. Heavy metal, besides maybe electronic, is the most wide-spanning genre format that there is. There are dozens upon dozens upon dozens of subgenres and offshoots, all with their own enriched culture, backgrounds, personnel, specific places of the world, epicenters of musicality, and so many different types of production techniques, playing styles, rhythmic approaches, vocal techniques, frontmen, controversies, and so many things in between. And what I am going to attempt to embark upon in this video essay is an encyclopedia of all the metal subgenres and genres, their definitions, what they entail, some bands to check out if you're looking to get into them, what their sounds are, and just an introduction into so many different genres and subgenres within this movement. Both beginners, intermediate people, and experts can find something from this video because I am talking about so many genres. Now there is a preface, a caveat that I want to say about this video. I want to quickly explain three terms that aren't going to come up for every single genre, those being technical, melodic, and blackened. I am going to limit this video to only talking about the movements that specifically have had lasting impact. If a prefix like blackened, technical, or melodic can be put with like every genre, I could be here for 10 hours. So I'm only going to be talking about the subgenres that include those terms that have mattered, that have been large scale, or at least had some sort of underground movement within them that has made them have lasting impact. For the sake of consistency and cohesion, I will go over those three terms just really quick, so whenever I mention them, you understand where I'm coming from, so I don't have to repeat myself too much. Melodic basically entails melodicism, harmonious natures, more melody in the instrumentals, and a bigger focal point and focus on beauty, gorgeousness, and some sort of assortment that brings things together in a melodic fashion. Technical, anytime that is put before a genre, that basically means that the musicianship and the way specifically, but not limited to, the riffs are written in a way that is either rhythmatically, time signature-wise, or otherwise something to do with the way that the riffs are written in a more complex fashion, a more progressive fashion. And oftentimes when you hear the word technical, it can be replaced with progressive, and they mean the same thing. And then finally, blackened has been incorporated into a lot of different genres. What this means is that genre is influenced by black metal. This can be everything from the vocals to the production to the riff writing. Literally, it can have anything. Now, some bands obviously take these influences to another level and utilize them more, while others choose to just stay in their own lane and only have shades of the influences and aren't as eclectic. But those are what those three terms mean. I'm only going to be talking about the genres that have those prefixes if they are important to some sort of underground or mainstream movement within metal. Otherwise, I could put blackened, melodic, and technical in front of any of these genres, and I'm sure you could come up with some bands that fit that criteria. If you end up enjoying this video, be sure to like this video. A lot of work is going into this, and subscribe if you're new to the channel. I would really appreciate it, and leave down in the comment section below what is your favorite metal genre and why. Without further ado, let's get right into the video. I'm going to go under the supposition that anyone that is watching this video has a preconceived notion of heavy metal just as a genre, so I'm not really going to discuss that much, but that is basically the tree. I'm going to be discussing the many branches, starting with thrash metal. Thrash metal began in the 1980s when it kickstarted as an offshoot of both hardcore punk music and speed metal, which arose in the 1970s. It was an answer to heavy metal and speed metal and hardcore punk being put in a faster tempo with more exasperated confrontational vocals and a bigger emphasis on shredding type of riffs and more of an emphasis on solos. A lot of the riff writing tends to be fast-paced, frantic, and extremely shreddy. If you listen to any thrash metal band, chances are immediately you're going to notice how fast-paced their riff writing is and how much they rely on solos, and the BPM is just pretty awesome. They adopted a lot of hardcore punk isms in the lyrical department where they confront everything from the social hierarchy. There are also many bands that campaign for things like veganism, equality, civil action. The big four of American thrash metal are the bands that most people know: Metallica, Anthrax, Megadeth, and Slayer. But the German thrash metal scene, which a lot of people also know about, I would also very much recommend, as Germany is a major hotspot for thrash metal as well, and they have their own big four, being Sodom, Creator, Destruction, and Tankard, and any of those bands are also a very good place to start. And while I mention this genre, I'll go ahead and talk a bit about speed metal. Speed metal came about in the 1970s, and the band that most people would associate it with would be Motorhead. Speed metal was an answer to the British heavy metal scene, where you had bands that wanted to take on more of an aggressive delivery with a bit more punk influence. Most of this had more discordancy, and you saw distortion started being added into heavy metal and the heavy metal formula. This genre is basically the progenitor of thrash metal, and it can be very much considered like proto-thrash metal because many of the same riff writing ideas from a band like Motorhead would later go on to influence a ton of thrash metal bands. But if you're not a fan of how heavy thrash metal can sometimes be, but you still like the riff writing and the speed of it, speed metal would be a good place to start, and I would definitely recommend Motorhead, as they're not only a classic and have a lot of influences coming from the heavy metal scene that they came up in, but they also have some of the later foundations that would become a staple for so many other fast-paced genres like thrashcore and like thrash metal. Groove metal. Groove metal came about mostly in the 1990s with bands like Pantera, Soulfly, Sepultura, Lamb of God, with a lot of very mainstay vocalists that became extremely well known. Phil Anselmo, Randy Blythe of Lamb of God, as well as amazing guitarists like Dimebag Darrell of Pantera, rest his soul. Groove metal is an interesting genre because it actually maintained a good bit of popularity in the 1990s and early 2000s, despite being one of the heavier takes on heavy metal. Groove metal, if I had to explain it, is imagine you took the formula of heavy metal and made it extremely slower and toned it down to be more chuggy and more chunky as opposed to the fast-pacedness of thrash metal. If anything, it is an answer to thrash metal. Groove metal, while it is slower, it also is thicker, and the vocals tend to be a lot more raspy, a lot more grunterial, and to have a project, not only a project, but many projects be able to burst in the mainstream, a lot of that was thanks to MTV, because a band like Pantera blew up with a record like Vulgar Display of Power or Far Beyond Driven, which ended up topping the Billboard Top 200 charts. These records are, in comparison to a lot of other records of the 90s, very much heavy, especially when you compare it to other heavy metal and thrash metal bands that were coming out in the contemporary time period. Groove metal is chuggier, it's lower, it's heavier, and a lot of times it has that layered atmosphere of just brutality and a very hostile and angry environment to the entire production that they took on, with some of the most classic vocalists and classic guitar players with some of the best rhythmatically composed metal anthems of the 1990s and early 2000s. Power metal. Power metal would probably be known to anyone that is familiar with Rock Band or Guitar Hero, because if you're not familiar with metal, you definitely know a band like Dragon Force. Some other bands would be like Rhapsody of Fire, Camelot, Blind Guardian. Power metal notoriously, but not always, has a tenor man singing. It is what has become a staple of power metal. A lot of people call this genre cheesy and corny, and the reason for this is Basically, power metal is a symphonic take on heavy metal that is extremely energetic, upbeat, high-pitched, high-strained, and has a focus on history, mythology, and fantasy. They lay into the camp, the thematics, they are very anthemic, and anthemic is an understatement because this triumphant atmosphere of pretty much every power metal track listing ever is really appealing to certain people that don't like as heavy of like some of the grittier metal genres. Oftentimes the riffs tend to be a little show-off-ish and really fast-paced, very rip-roaring, but also has that upbeat nature that I mentioned earlier. A lot of proficiency coming from the riffs. The vocals can be an acquired taste because, like I said, not always, but most of the time tenors are the lead vocalist of these bands and they tend to be very high-pitched. So think AC/DC on steroids. Soaring vocals that just reach for the stars. If you're a fan of like dark fantasy and high fantasy, this is a genre to check out, although you're not usually going to get darker tracks. So if you want more sort of emotional and darker track listings, you're not going to find it from power metal usually. It's not my cup of tea, but I know a lot of people that enjoy it. On the topic of Camelot, as well as bands like Within Temptation and Nightwish, I'm going to shout out Symphonic Metal. Symphonic Metal is exactly what you would imagine it would be. It is a traditional heavy metal take on orchestral elements. Most of these track listings are very comparable to heavy metal or even power metal at times, but they are linked together with orchestral instrumentation. This is most usually strings and woodwinds, everything from flutes to cellos to violins to piano. It has a Celtic vibe a lot, but is different from, say, folk music. If power metal is anthemic in the over-the-top way, symphonic metal is anthemic in the beautiful and gorgeous way. It really tries to bind together a lot of these different instruments into the fold. It's a little glitzy and glamorous, and oftentimes the production is extremely clean. So if that sounds like something you would like, this might be a genre for you to check out. Now let's get into one of the longest lasting genres and its subgenres. Death metal. Death metal started in the 1980s, and I'm not going to be getting into an argument over whether Possessed or Death started it. I would be here for like 10 years if I talked about that, but Death and Possessed are the two bands that are pretty much the harbingers and the progenitors of this style, and in the 80s and 90s it started to become more popular with bands like Autopsy, Morbid Angel, Obituary, Cannibal Corpse, Deicide, and so many more. Death metal is one of the genres that has the most offshoots and the most side genres. It's known for being gruesome and gritty and confrontational and extremely controversial. In the lyrics, the album arts, and pretty much everything about it, it wants to be obscene, it wants to be vile, it wants to be putrid. But in the infancy of death metal in the early 80s up to the mid 80s, it was more so influenced by thrash metal. Death metal is insanely influenced by thrash metal, and if you go back to some of the starting bands like Possessed and Death, they did not adopt many of the staples such as the grunterial death growls that would later become such a staple for death metal, but aren't just limited to that genre, in favor of more shrieked and confrontational thrash metal-esque vocals and solos and down-tempo riffs. Death metal started to take it into a different direction. They turned down the intensity, slowed things down, and became more chunky, distorted, down-tempo, low-tuned, and started to adopt the signature death growls of frontmen like Corpse Grinder Fisher of Cannibal Corpse. These low, grunterial, bassy, like those types of vocals is what became the staple of death metal. Death metal has always been one of the most controversial but also well-renowned genres in the metal sphere and has attracted everyone from Jim Carrey, of all people, to tracks being featured on things like Beavis and Butthead back in the day. Death metal has been one of the longest-lasting genres in the metal field. Moving on from there, I'm going to be talking about tech death, technical death metal. You can also call this progressive death metal, but this is one of the longest-lasting death metal subgenres. So, technical death metal was an answer to death metal's more sort of gritty and simplistic and minimalistic take on the genre. Death kind of kickstarted this when they started to play around with different progressive elements in their music to soup up the technicality. And then with bands like Cynic, it boosted it up even more. And even bands like Obituary and Autopsy played around a little bit with progressiveness. This catapulted into the 2000s and 2010s when you had so many fast-paced, just insane BPM death metal bands like The Faceless, Rings of Saturn, Fallujah at times, who are more deathcore influenced. Or bands like Archspire, for example. Tech death basically takes death metal out of its comfort zone of being a slow, sloggy, murky experience and takes it into a more cleanly produced, proficient, musically efficient, extremely fast, extremely tight, razor-thin type of production. And these tracks are oftentimes extremely well made and well put together, but it's not everyone's cup of tea and has attracted some detractors because people think that death metal should stay in its lane of being exactly what it is. It pretty much is the exact opposite of death metal in many ways, and it was its answer to being more simplistic in favor of more sort of fast-paced styles. And the people that say that it should have stayed in its lane, Death, the band you praise, were one of the people who pretty much started the whole thing, so I don't want to hear it. You are pissing on the grave of Chuck if you say that death metal was only intended to be one thing and one thing alone. You are like taking a piss on his ambition and his dreams. Next up, I'll talk about melodic death metal, also known as mellow death. Mellow death, similar to technical death metal, took death metal in a different direction. Most of the bands that came about were from the Scandinavian area, places like Norway, places like Sweden. Bands like Amon Amarth, In Flames, Dark Tranquillity, At the Gates all fall into this specific category. Melodic death metal, similar to symphonic metal, is exactly what you would imagine it would be. It's death metal taken in more of a harmonious and melodic tone. Oftentimes, these tracks have more beauty to them and a more expansive atmospheric edge to them. They're not always losing their edge, but they definitely take a step away from the brutality of the forefathers of the genre in favor of a little bit more expansiveness and atmosphere and ambiance in their instrumentation, and a lot of these also layer with technicality, and they bridge the gap between simplicity and more happy-go-lucky instrumentation. But don't be fooled into thinking that these bands don't have an edge to them. Bands like Amon Amarth, bands like In Flames have a ton of bite to them. But if you're particularly not a fan of the technicality of technical death metal, maybe it's a little too frantic and chaotic for you, and you're also not a fan of the gritty, low-tuned nature of plain death metal, melodic death metal might be something you would want if you like more atmosphere in your music and want something a little bit more slower and easier to digest. Next up, I'm going to be talking about death and roll. Most of the death and roll bands came from Sweden. Sweden sort of originated this style. Bands like Dismember, bands like Entombed were the ones that really kickstarted it, and nowadays you even have great bands like Kvelertak who really carry the style on. It is death metal that is played at more of a tempo that is similar to classic rock and roll music. That basically means that the riffs tend to be a little more galloping, the percussion tends to be a little more thumping, and it's not as heavy as death metal typically is, but they definitely still have an edge to them. But a lot of times I've noticed that death and roll bands have more catchiness to them, more grooves to them, and aren't afraid to slip into some quote-unquote softer riffs and softer percussive elements to break up a track. So if you're a fan of classic rock and roll music, but you want something a little bit more kind of edgy and a little bit more dark and a little more kind of influenced by the Swedish and the Norwegian death metal scenes, this would be a good place to start as well. Next up, I am going to be talking about this genre and its many subgenres for a hot minute because the history is probably the most well-known of any metal genre ever, black metal. Black metal's been associated with many things: controversy, Satanism, church burnings, murder, every bad publicity, things like Lords of Chaos improperly publicized everything, and black metal has been on the cutting edge of controversy from the get-go. And once again, most of the history is mixed in with Norway and Sweden. Venom, Bathory, Celtic Frost, Merciful Fate, all of these bands were instrumental in crafting the foundation of black metal. But black metal is an outsider culture in every sense of the word. Black metal is by far the most hostile, unwelcoming, dark, disturbing, unsettling genre in all of metal. with, in my opinion, I believe the most subgenres that I'm going to be talking about in this video, some of the most rich history. Black metal started around a similar time to death metal, but took on a completely different tone. While it was influenced by thrash metal similar to death metal, it took it in a more insulated, cold, icy direction. Minimalistically produced, extremely lo-fi in the way it comes across, brittle production techniques, and a vocal style that would become ubiquitous with the style, that being the shriek, the black metal shriek. Throaty, tortured, most of these artists tend to be very troubled and mentally ill back in the day, with some very disturbed individuals that ended up crafting this genre. Now, I'm not going to generalize, but when it comes to the history of the biggest forefathers of the genre, specifically in the Norwegian black metal scene, which I will talk about shortly, there is a lot of mental illness, a lot of disturbing facts, a lot of very rebellious natures. It was anti-culture in every sense of the word. And while it has a bad reputation for the controversy, for the church burnings that existed as a result of the genre, to the murders, to the very unwelcoming community within black metal, I don't want that to deter anyone, because black metal is one of the most fascinating, well-rounded, and completely multifaceted genres that you will find in all of metal, if just at all. Blast beats are something that is very associated with black metal. The riffs are extremely Frost-like, and the lyrics, at least back in the day, dealt with everything from anti-Christianity to Satanism to violence to depression to literally suicide. It has always attempted to be shocking, to be outsider culture, to be a home for all of the deranged, for all of the outcasts, and that's exactly the environment it created. But let's go into some of the bands and some of the subgenres that exist within black metal. Because even though it is a heavily elitist genre, there are many subgenres that are very well accepted and renowned, even in the underground. So Norwegian black metal. This is where all of the shit comes from. This is where the history arises from. Every name that you will ever hear associated with the pain and sorrow and controversy of black metal, whether it be Varg Dead, Euronymous, Necrobutcher, these come from Norway. The Norwegians were the ones that kickstarted this entire style, and if it wasn't for the influence of Norway, this genre would have never been what it was. Bands like Mayhem, Dark Throne, Burzum, Immortal all laid the foundation for a tortured, unwelcoming, low-fidelity recording technique that would inspire tens of thousands of black metal bands that would come after them. Not to mention, in Sweden, you would also later get bands like Dissection and Melodic, which would take the Norwegian style and take it into different directions and darker directions. If I said hostile about black metal, Norwegian black metal takes that to the next level and the next caliber of being unwelcoming and cold and frigid. These recordings are sharp as bones. They are so raw, and when it comes to demos and albums, you will find some of the most highest regarded records coming out of Norway, and any of the bands that I mentioned would be a place to start. Everything that was associated with the Norwegian black metal scene was full of intrigue. The murders, the church burnings, the lyrics, the corpse paint, the things that became the staples came from Norway. Everything that would later be the hallmarks of pretty much every black metal genre and every black metal subgenre, it came from Norway. It's controversial, it's fascinating, and I highly suggest, if you want some just straight horror stories, research it. Are you a fan of bands like Akercock, Goat Whore, or specifically Behemoth? You might be a fan of Blackened Death Metal. Blackened Death Metal takes the down-tempo riffs and the death metal production techniques and mixes it with blast beats and black metal shrieks. Now, it very much is a give and take, because you have certain bands on one side of the spectrum that take more of a death metal approach with black metal embellishments, where it will be down-tempo and heavy and guttural with the black metal embellishments like shrieks and blast beats and cold production techniques. But on the other side of that coin, you'll also get the opposite, with black metal bands that have death metal influence. So there isn't really one right or wrong way to do it, but if you look up Blackened Death Metal and search up some of the bands, you will get a mixture of that sound. And if you don't like one or two bands, keep looking, because there is a lot of different influences and a lot of different ways of going about the genre fusion, and it's probably one of the largest ranging genre fusions when it comes to both the black and death metal genres, and has a lot of great bands under that wing, 3 of which I mentioned. I would say my personal favorite is Ackercock. The next subgenre I'll be talking about is Blackgaze, also known as post-black metal. Blackgaze takes on shoegaze music and post-metal into a black metal forefront. This has gotten controversial opinions from the black metal elitists of the world. Bands like Death Heaven, who blew up with the record Sunbather, and records like New Bermuda, as well as a band like Alsace coming from France. These bands were the trailblazers, and while I don't necessarily hear Blackgaze being performed as much as it once was to the same degree, these two bands are the place to start if you want an indication of it. The reason Blackgaze has attracted so many people that have disliked the style is because black metal tends to be insulated in a raw fashion. Blackgaze pretties it up because shoegaze and post-metal tend to be lumbering, like a walking cadaver in a sense, where the tracks are longer, more paced, well thought out, but also very cleanly produced and atmospheric, which is something that some black metal fans just don't particularly like. And even if I'm not seeing that many people performing Blackgaze nowadays, it is a very big staple in black metal, because in the 2010s, you could not escape or go past any reviewer corner, whether that be metal or not, reviewing some like Death Heaven record or Alsace record. Even Anthony Fantano talked about Death Heaven. Like, everyone knew about this record. Everyone knew about Sunbather. And it's kind of interesting to me because this genre broke into sort of the mainstream. Like, a lot of people knew the name Death Heaven in the 2010s, and it's kind of cool, but I understand why, because it is a more digestible version of black metal. On the same topic of sort of that vibe of black metal, black ambient, I would mention the band Ulver, sort of, even though they're a little more experimental. Black ambient is pretty much what you'd imagine. Now, you might think that black ambient would be black metal influenced by ambient music or vice versa, but it's actually different. Even though it is most usually created by black metal artists, usually what will happen is there'll be an offshoot project by a solo member of a black metal band that will make a dark ambient record or a black ambient record. Oftentimes you'll hear dark ambient and black ambient kind of put side by side, but the only correlation is a lot of times black metal solo ventures will incorporate dark ambient and black ambient influences, and it usually is sort of these slow-paced, very inspired by orchestral elements. They are very minimalistic and scant and bare bones. They're beautiful and eerie and ominous. They'll tend to be dark and morbid and forlorn, kind of a foreboding atmosphere. Now, another kind of controversial black metal subgenre, symphonic black metal. I'm talking bands like Cradle of Filth, Dimmu Borgir, as well as Summoning. Symphonic black metal tends to have a better production style first off, and those symphonic elements of symphonic metal will become very apparent quickly with a band like Cradle of Filth or Dimmu Borgir that will have orchestral and thematic elements that are anthemic and very epic and over the top, packed in with blast beats from black metal and shrieks. Most of the time their production will be a lot more cleaned up. But what about war metal? War metal, a lot of times people forget, is an offshoot of black metal. War metal is a very ferocious, unadulteratedly violent take on black metal. Bands like Bestial Warlust and my favorite, Revenge. Noisy, abrasive, frantic, chaotic, unstoppable. Usually these tracks have no pace to them besides bust your head in. They're not paced, they're not slow, they're not expansive, they're not atmospheric. They are exactly what they entail. War, ferocity, violence, shock. If you want black metal that is so much faster and more panicky and exasperated and has a level of intensity that is so tense to it, check it out. Raw black metal. I'm not a big fan of this genre. I'm gonna be honest. I'm not a fan of this subgenre. It is black metal that is just taking the dial even further down into the lo-fi territory. Unfathomable depths of low fidelity recordings. The vocals will sound like they are 1,000 paces in the distance, like underground somehow. The riffs are sometimes hard to decipher and are extremely ear-scraping and brittle. They don't put any effects on anything. They record things in the most grotesque way. A lot of people like raw black metal because it stays closer to the original formula, but is even more ear-scraping and ear-grating than like the early black metal bands that had demos. It's shrill, it's brittle, it is harsh, and some people like that. Unblack Metal. Antestor is the band I'm going to shout out, and it's probably the band that anyone that knows this genre will know and kind of appreciate if they like the genre. Unblack Metal is black metal performed by Christians. Considering, and the reason I'm shouting this out is because black metal has a lot of times a focal point on Satanism and religion, anti-Christianity. Unblack metal was an answer to that. So if you're not a fan of that like anti-Christian religious like aspect and the Satanistic aspects of some of the classic bands, this might be a genre you'll like because it's everything that black metal is, but Christian. Either directly talking about Christianity or at least being performed by Christians. NSBM, National Socialist Black Metal. This has been a genre that should be far less popular than it is. It's popped up everywhere, and I don't even think I need to explain it that much. I did a whole video essay on Reek of the Unzen Gas Fumes. These are basically neo-Nazis. That's what it is. That is what this movement is. It is black metal performed by people who want to be Nazis. Everything from swastikas to racist undertones, homophobic, transphobic undertones, violent natures, misogyny, everything that you can put into a sound to make it offensive. And it's not just for shock and awe. There are so many bands that are genuinely believing this, and their fan bases are extremely dangerous. I mean, believe what you want to believe, but you'll never catch me dead reviewing an NSBM band. And I should also point out, this is just a black metal genre. Like, it sounds like black metal. It's similar to Unblack Metal, where it's more so the lyrics that change it and change the genre distinction. And on a similar note, DSBM is depressing suicidal black metal. Yeah, I know, whoop-de-doo, that is a genre tag and a half. So this is a genre that quite a few YouTubers have covered and some people like, and it's similar to what it sounds like. It is black metal played at such a slow tempo, a sad, melancholic, depressive atmosphere to it. The vocals are tortured, the vocals are just harrowing, and sometimes just shouts and screams that are so full of pain and resentment and spite and just unrestrained rage towards the human race. The lyrics are very, very, very edgy and extremely dark. Like, they don't leave any stone unturned when it comes to talking about what their topic matters are. It's slow, it is slow-paced, and it is grim. But now we're moving from the black metal subgenres into grindcore and its many subgenres. So grindcore came about in the 80s, much like death metal and black metal, and was an answer to both thrash and hardcore punk music turned up to a more dissonant, discordant tempo. These tracks are known for being abrupt, for being fast, for being extremely frazzled out and distorted, blown out, so much feedback, vocals that are unenunciated and fast-paced, frantic, and chaotic. The chaos of their sounds usually erupt in a flurry of anything from 10-second songs to a minute 30 songs. You'll get albums that are like 40 and 50 songs worth and may only be 30 minutes worth of material. They burst through track listings, they burst through records. Some of the bands that are very known would be Napalm Death, as well as Siege, who are considered like the progenitors of this style and also founded Power Violence. Other bands would be Terrorizer, Repulsion, and if we're going semi-more modern, bands like Wormrot, bands like Discordant Axis, Pig Destroyer, as well as some of the older bands like Anal Cunt. Nasum's another one that comes to mind. The riffs are blown out, the vocals are all over the place, the ideas are scatterbrained, the style is offensive, and it is one of the fastest paced genres in all of metal. So if you want fast-paced, and I'm talking anything more than anything I've talked about prior, these things reach BPMs that are like unimaginable to the human race in like 20-second songs. But what about gore grind? Gore grind is a genre that took grindcore music and turned up the intensity and changed it around a little bit. Gore grind takes more of a medical pathology to it. Most of the bands have medical vibes, medical song titles, medical album covers. Carcass was the band that basically made this genre what it is, and even though Carcass changed their style throughout the years into more of a melodic death metal style with bands like Heartwork, they were the ones that pretty much kickstarted this entire genre. Carcass is an amazing place to start, but if you want a more modern band with a bit of a better production style, Cattle Decapitation's early work has gore grind tendencies. And another hallmark of gore grind compared to grindcore is the pitch-shifted vocals that are literally straight out of a toilet. They are wobbly, they are unintelligible, they are soupy, they are just like basically a fluid coming up. It sounds like straight vomit half the time, and they pride themselves on having these watery, washed out vocals that are pitch-shifted, which is something different than grindcore. But if you want another genre that is pretty much like gore grind, but once again, a different topic matter like NSBM was, porno grind. Porno grind is literally exactly what you would imagine. Instead of the medical pathology, it is replaced with sexually explicit and repulsive lyrics in that. Some of the bands include Gut, as well as Cock and Ball Torture, and a lot of other bands that I can think of that I don't think I can say on this platform without getting banned because they are so obscene. Porno grind is one of the most offensive metal genres. It strives to be so unwelcoming and so harsh to listen to, with some of the most grotesque and horrendous lyrics you'll ever hear. But what about death grind? Bands like Hemorrhage, bands like Cattle Decapitation, bands like Benighted. Death grind is grindcore music mixed with death metal. It's a little more accessible than grindcore. I would say it's very much more accessible than grindcore, because while grindcore goes for that more harsh, brutal style, death grind takes on more of an approach of that down-tempo death metal influence with more grunterial growls. Whereas grindcore mixes up the vocals, layers them, has shrieks on like death metal growls, this really brings it up even more, and it has a lot of times more death metal influence. It's similar to Blackened Death Metal though, where you really have to know the bands you're checking out, because there is a give and take, like I said with Blackened Death Metal. No two bands are going to have the same approach, no two bands are going to have the same amount of death metal and grindcore influence, but death grind is pretty much known for being pummeling, for being throttling, and most of the time they take more death metal influence than anything, but that very much is a subjective thing. But what about doom metal, one of the most longest lasting genres that predates death metal, black metal, grindcore? This began with bands like Black Sabbath, Pentagram, St. Vitus. Doom metal is slow-paced, atmospheric, moody, broody, forlorn, and in that slow-paced atmosphere comes more thicker riffs and more drenched in like atmosphere and reverb type of riffs. The vocals are a lot of times more chant-like and dark. It's like you're standing at like an altar listening to some dark preacher, because alongside the meandering instrumentation, the vocalists tended to take a more like slow-paced delivery with their vocals too, that ended up making a lot of these bands turn into these chanters, like they are like starting some demonic like summoning ritual. Doom metal is the direct genre that is the opposite, the antithesis of like death metal and black metal and grindcore. If you want the more slower paced and well thought out type of instrumentation that takes some time to really get behind with very long tracks, doom metal is one of the most classic metal genres, and inspired quite a few genres that came after it. So let's talk about some of doom metal's subgenres. Epic doom metal is the first one I'm going to talk about, and this is a very idiosyncratic style, a little hard to define. Candlemass is the band that pretty much represents this style, but there are other ones. Epic doom metal in its traditional sense is doom metal that is very slow, but also anthemic. Similar to a symphonic metal track or a symphonic metal band, it doesn't have to contain symphonic elements, but most epic doom metal bands do pack in some of those orchestral instruments. Funeral doom metal, one of my favorite subgenres in the metal field, bands like Bellwitch, bands like Mournful Congregation. Funeral doom metal takes the doom metal style and slows it down even more. Most of these tracks will have death growls associated with them that are even slower and drenched in atmosphere than you could ever imagine. The tempos are slowed down to such a pace where you might hear a riff every 10 to 15 seconds. Some of these tracks are 20, 30, 40 minutes long and may only consist of like 3 or 4 progressions, if that. This is one of those genres that has an experience, like a full body experience, and you really have to sit down and process it. And if you don't like slow music, you're not going to enjoy it. If you don't like atmospheric metal, you're probably not going to enjoy it. If you aren't a fan of doom metal as is, there's no chance you're going to like funeral doom metal, in my opinion, because it is the slowed down like step cousin that with like the gnarled up cloak around like their neck sitting in the corner. But hey, I like it. Death doom, bands like Anathema, My Dying Bride. Death metal and doom metal mixed together, similar to what I said about Blackened Death metal and Death Grind. It is a give and take, but most of the time the death metal comes through in the riff writing and the vocals, whereas the doom metal tempos are what carries these tracks forward. So if you want doom metal that is mixed with more of the down-tempo riff writing and has that gothic influence from doom metal, that's a good start. Gothic metal and Gothic-Doom metal. Typo Negative is a good example of like this. Peter Steele, one of my favorite metal vocalists of all time. Gothic metal's the dripping Victorian mansion, like with lanterns on the walls. It is slow paced like doom metal, but has the campiness of a gothic like Odyssey. A lot of the bands like talking about horror, vampirism, and just those dark natured topic matters that, while doom metal has like adopted in the past, maybe not to this degree. Unless you're talking about Black Sabbath. Ozzy was a madman. Drone metal was very influenced by doom metal, which consists of bands like Sun and bands like Boris. Sun is probably my favorite drone metal band, and it is feedback heavy. Much like funeral doom metal, these tracks are so long and so slow with only the occasional riff. It is feedback galore, distorted, blown out riffs. Sometimes they have vocals, but most of the time these bands opt to just be instrumental led. Drone metal is an acquired taste because it is very unwelcoming to listen to and takes a lot to really appreciate, because a lot of it can just sound like white noise, like static, but Sun has some of the best material in the game, and I even made a video essay about why they're important, and they've influenced a ton of bands that's come after them. Boris has as well. And also, if you ever get the chance to see like a drone metal band live, I've heard that like drone metal bands are some of the best metal bands to see live. Sludge metal, bands like Crowbar, Acid Bath, the Melvins, I Hate God. Sludge metal is like the doom metal cousin that has more heavy and thick soundscapes. They are stoner inspired and oftentimes take on sometimes a psychedelic edge, but most of the time it is more pronounced in the thick department. The riffs will have a certain level of venom to them, pun unintended with sludge, but they'll be poisonous and they will be dripped out, not necessarily with the reverb of doom metal, but more so the punch of stoner and psychedelic music. Now let's get into metalcore and its many subgenres. Talking about metalcore is like talking about a dragon, because it's mythological and it has many different subsets, but I'll go over some of them before I go into the subgenres. Metalcore is a mixture of heavy metal and hardcore punk, complete with breakdowns, metalcore breakdowns, mosh-friendly riffs. It is perfect for like pits, vocals that cycle between shrieks, growls, and usually soaring choruses, but there are many different like microcultures within metalcore. When it first started, you had bands like Earth Crisis and Integrity and Converge. A lot of bands came from the New England area, and they tended to find more of a kind of vegan, straight edge, hardcore punk vibe to them. They were heavy, they were chunky, they were throttling. And then in the 2000s, you started to see more metalcore bands that were more buff and gruff and started to adopt the sung, clean choruses. These were bands like Killswitch Engage and As I Lay Dying. And then in the mid-2000s, you started to get the scene kids. You started to get all of the bands that encompassed metalcore as a whole, that bursted it into being one of the most popular metal genres ever. So even though bands like Converge and Integrity and Hatebreed were over there kicking ass in the metalcore way, you had these scene kids that were taking it in a whole different direction. And it also overlapped a lot with post-hardcore music, which I'll kind of lump into this discussion. Post-hardcore, similarly to metalcore, was extremely emo inspired. It had this emo veneer to it, and in the 2000s it blew up in malls and Hot Topics and Spencer's and all of these music videos with bands like Seosin, Sleeping with Sirens, Pierce the Veil, Bring Me the Horizon, as well as Asking Alexandria, I See Stars, Hawthorne Heights, My Chemical Romance. All of these bands were like the staples of this style. And then you had other bands that boosted it in popularity even more, like Bullet for My Valentine, for example. But then on the flip side, you had the heavier, more accessible metalcore bands like Killswitch Engage and As I Lay Dying, which had enough radio appeal to mainstream metal listeners, and all of this combined made this perfect storm where metalcore had hundreds of bands within the post-hardcore and metalcore genres, with these mosh-friendly breakdowns and these soaring choruses and these hyper-anthemic choruses and these confessional, tear-stained diary-type lyrics. But what about deathcore? Deathcore, one of the most hated genres of all time. I love deathcore. Like, I don't care what people say. I love deathcore. It is the combination of death metal and metalcore, and it brings in more shrieks and blast beats and death growls and harsher, like, vibes. Early Bring Me the Horizon, Whitechapel, as well as Suicide Silence, rest in peace Mitch Lucker, Despised Icon, The Red Chord, and bands like Job for a Cowboy and Oceano also are examples of deathcore. Deathcore takes on a lower tempo and is oftentimes heavier, and it just does not have clean singing. Some bands have played around with that progressive technicality with like choruses and things of that nature, but most of the time it is these layered vocals that are death growls and shrieks. A staple of deathcore is, yes, it has the breakdowns of metalcore, but unlike metalcore, the layering of the vocals becomes more apparent in practically every deathcore band. Shrieks and growls layer atop one another. And if you're not a fan of like the pretty boy, glitzy, glamorous singing of metalcore, deathcore might be more up your alley if you like the more extreme vibes, but it has caught so much flack because deathcore overlapped greatly with scene kids, and a lot of scene kids adopted like early Bring Me the Horizon and Suicide Silence as like their style icons, with people like Mitch Lucker and Oliver Sykes being the people that they aspired to be, and it was seen as commercially viable metal and digestible metal, and sellout material and sellout culture became a massive staple of the discussion with deathcore. On the flip side, what about mathcore? The Dillinger Escape Plan is most likely the most well-known mathcore band. It is like a version of metalcore music that is much more proficient, much more technically efficient. They like to be more technical, they like to be more progressive, and oftentimes these riffs have odd time signatures to them, are all over the place, are very scatterbrained, and very mechanical sounding, electronic without having to be electronic. The weirdest time signatures, the weirdest progressions. Mathcore is all over the place. It is kind of the metal version of math rock, which already has a lot of cool riff ideas, but if you like experimentation and you like stuff off the beaten path, it's a great place to start, and I suggest any of the Dillinger Escape Plan's discography. Electronicore, I'm talking bands like Asking Alexandria, The Browning, Crossfade, I See Stars, metalcore music with a ton of synths laden into the sound. I'm talking electric keyboards, I'm talking all those synths. The cringiness of like Etienne Sin would be a great place to start. I highly suggest going and laughing at that material, but Attack Attack, Inner Shikari, these electronic infused metalcore bands, they take the metalcore style, the breakdowns, the vocals, the choruses, and mix it in with a lot of very cheesy and kind of corny synths. I'm not going to say all bands do it wrong, but most of the time it doesn't come across too appealing, but maybe it will to you if you check out any of those bands. Sasscore. My favorite band from this is See You Space Cowboy. I will die on their heel forever. Sasscore is metalcore, screamo, and post-hardcore music brought together to be sassy and to be spastic and frantic, almost grindcore inspired in the way the instrumentation comes across, but oftentimes these bands are very hyper-conscious of LGBTQ issues, veganism, civil rights issues, and most of the lead vocalists, or at least a lot of the members, tend to be on the LGBTQ spectrum. So I think that may be something that would appeal to certain people that are looking for more of that. The very whimpery lead vocals are also a staple. High in the throat, they're very nasally. So if that sounds interesting to you, check them out. Screamo. People need to shut the ever-living hell up and stop calling all metal vocals screamo, because that's not the case. Screamo is its own genre. Orchid, Silverstein, Page 99, my favorite screamo band, Circle Takes the Square. Screamo is emo music that is even more Tear-Stained Diary with very shouted vocals. There's really no technique to the vocals. They are just shouted at the top of their lungs and have this emotional edge to them. Think everything of emo music of a band like Hawthorne Heights or My Chemical Romance, but in a metal way. And screamo has been associated and used as a descriptor for all metal vocals. Screamo is its own genre. It is its own lane, and the bands are their own entities. Checking out any of those bands will let you know that screamo is not just a vocal technique. Nu metalcore. I don't like nu metalcore much, but it's like Alpha Wolf, Cane Hill of Mice and Men. Basically, nu metalcore takes nu metal, which I will talk about soon, and takes it with metalcore. The disjointed nu metal industrial tinged riffs are pretty much what are here. I don't like the genre fusion, but if you are a fan of nu metal and you want or are planning on getting into metalcore music, these bands could be a good place to start because they have that industrial tinge and sometimes the rap moments of a nu metal band combined with metalcore. Speaking of nu metal, probably some of the most well-known metal bands of all time, you've probably heard these even if you're not a metalhead: System of a Down, Limp Bizkit, Korn, Linkin Park, and I know people controversially call them this, but even Slipknot would be considered nu metal at many points in their career. Nu metal came from punk culture, and it wasn't even meant to be accessible at first, it just kind of became that. Nu metal pretty much is rap and hip-hop beats and vocals being influenced with metal instrumentation, usually funky, usually groovy, with very cool choruses. An unsettling vibe to it. Bands like System of a Down and Limp Bizkit and Korn usually have this staccato vocal delivery, and bands like Linkin Park bring in rap into the forefront, which has caused a lot of people to call nu metal rap metal because many of the bands do encompass that. But it is a wide-ranging genre because a band like Korn, which is a band that is much more creepy and unsettling and goes for more of that industrial element, still are considered nu metal, but it's because of the freakish and off-kilter way that rhythmatically the compositions are created. The riffs tend to be all over the place. They'll bounce up and down, they'll ascend and descend, and even if they're not industrial, a lot of things can be considered nu metal. But any of those bands would be a wonderful place to start if you're unfamiliar with the genre, but I don't see how you've never heard any of those bands, honestly. And on the topic of that, funk metal with bands like sometimes Red Hot Chili Peppers is considered it, but Rage Against the Machine and Primus. Think of nu metal, but with a bigger emphasis on bass. Funk metal is determined by the bass. The bass is the forefront instrument, funky grooves, and if you are a bass aficionado or someone that enjoys bass in your music, this is the genre for you. Glam metal. Do I even need to talk about glam metal? I feel like I should talk about glam metal. Poison, Skid Row, Bon Jovi, Whitesnake, Steel Panther, long flowing hair, and anthemic arena rock stadium anthems. Love songs for all of the women who take their bras off and flash their tits on stage. That is literally what glam metal is. They got all of the chicks, but they evidently didn't get the musical gene that made them good songwriters, because so many of these tracks are some of the worst aged metal tracks ever, and I'm glad that this genre died, but for the sake of it, I'll talk about it. Like I said, manly men in leotards with curly blonde hair. That is most of what this genre was, and they appealed to the stadium and arena rock sort of vibe. If you've ever heard stadium rock or arena rock, most of these choruses were larger than life, able to be played in large concert venues and attract people to sing along, and 9 times out of 10, most of the songs they wrote about were love songs, which made a lot of people feel iffy about. But what about djent? Djent is an onomatopoeia term that a lot of people disrespect. It is a subgenre of progressive metal and metalcore. Bands like Era, Veil of Maya, Periphery, as well as Born of Osiris. Djent is known for being inspired by the sound that it comes from, the frazzled out style. Progressive metalcore is a term that is sort of interchanged with djent a lot. Djent bands seek to kind of take either metalcore or deathcore and infuse it with a polyrhythmic type of playing style that is usually palm muted, sometimes distorted, and oftentimes is emphasized on very high protection technical riff writing. And when you've heard a gent band, you've heard a lot of gent bands. I would personally suggest starting with Era, but that's just me. But on the topic of progressive metal, from modern bands like Between the Buried and Me and Animals as Leaders to older bands like Tool and Dream Theater, progressive metal came as an offshoot of progressive rock, bands like Rush, Yes, Pink Floyd, Jethro Tull, and even like early experimental bands like the Velvet Underground and the works of experimental artists like Frank Zappa. Progressive metal was made as an answer to metal to make it more intelligent. Oftentimes these are odysseys, some of the most like experimental and highbrow sort of riff writing, very technical, and they have no qualms about making their music very, very intelligent and cerebral. A lot of times the elitists and the highbrow metal fans like progressive music, but it is pretty damn beautiful. And if you're a progressive rock fan and a fan of any of those bands I mentioned, check out any of those. I would say probably start with Tool. Experimental metal, or what is known as avant-garde metal, is a bit hard to define. Bands like Portal, Behold the Arctopus, Despel Omega, Bostinage, all of these bands encompass avant-garde metal, and it's pretty much just a genre term that you can get thrown at if you just have a band that you can't describe. That's pretty much, take it from me, don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Avant-garde metal is just a version of saying, I don't know what genre label to stick on this, so I'm just going to call it avant-garde metal. That's pretty much what these records are. By no means they're bad, but they can be anything. They can be black metal, death metal, grindcore. They can come from any sphere, but avant-garde just means that they're off the beaten path and extremely experimental in some way, whether it be atmospherically, technically, production-wise, something about it, genre fusions, genre blendings. It doesn't matter, it just has to be very experimental to be called avant-garde music. Industrial metal, bands like Mushroomhead, Fudge Tunnel, Marilyn Manson, Nine Inch Nails, and Rammstein, which is their own genre of like German, like industrial metal, but I'm just talking about industrial here. When you hear the word industrial, you're going to think it means mechanical, factory, manufactured, and that's usually what these tracks entail. The production tactics that they will use will have clinging and clanging riffs and sometimes electronics mixed in with a distorted and blown out style that can sometimes feature a lot of feedback and creepy vocals, but it can range from everything from triumphant vibes like Rammstein, or it can have those creepy atmospheres like Marilyn Manson and especially Nine Inch Nails. Most people know Trent Reznor as he's like an incredible songwriter. It's not really homogenous and it's difficult to pin into one corner, but if you can imagine a factory with a bunch of odd machines being brought together to mix with heavy metal, you're on the right track to figuring out what industrial metal is, and any of those bands would be a great place to start. Nine Inch Nails and Rammstein are the best two examples on this list. Grunge. Let's talk about grunge. Stone Temple Pilots, Mudhoney, and the big four, Nirvana, Soundgarden, Pearl Jam, and Alice in Chains. And grunge has been on the cutting edge of being like, is it metal? Is it not? I consider it like metal influenced because if we're going to call like alternative metal that, I think we have to call grunge that. And alternative metal I will sort of lump into this because alternative as a label term, whether it's alternative rock or alternative metal, is difficult to define because it pretty much just encompasses anything with that distorted nature, the weird effects on vocals, the grungy aftermath, and you'll hear tons of bands nowadays called post-grunge. Post-grunge, I hear that label thrown around so much. But grunge was downtrodden. It was more so a movement than anything else, but it has such a unique style and tempo to it, that downtrodden, almost like depressive, forlorn, dejected, anti-world nature. Amazing frontmen have come from this genre, from Kurt Cobain to Chris Cornell, just so many that I can think of off the top of my head. Sometimes it's slow-paced, sometimes it's heavy, but the thick riffs are always a staple, and the vocals can be very understated and extremely monotone with a lumbering instrumental, but when they go heavy, they become more rushed, they become more visceral, they become more harsh to listen to, and I think that is like a staple of grunge. It is a look, it is that disheveled, I hate the world vibe, and a lot of people identify with that. It created a movement. And for so many bands nowadays to be called post-grunge, like alternative metal and rock bands, I think it shows the sheer influence of these bands. And if you want a modern band to check out, Swain is a really good modern grunge band. I feel the need to talk about Kawaii Metal. It's kind of like visual Kai Metal in like Japan. Baby Metal is like Kawaii Metal. It's Japanese metal with like really ooh-woo, like anime girls. That's pretty much most of what it is. I'm not gonna like crap on baby metal. They're just not my cup of tea, and I like their feature on Bring Me the Horizon's track Kingslayer, but it is Japanese influenced metal music, so that basically means it's fast paced and has the J-rock and J-metal influence going into it with baby metal pretty much. They were the ones that became the creators of this genre term. Folk metal with bands like Sayor, Fintroll, Moonsorrow are pretty much a lot like power metal and symphonic metal, but with a more Celtic influence. You'll hear a lot more violins, you'll hear a lot more flutes and cellos and harps in these bands. The folk influence of nature and the connection to nature, whether it be in the album covers or the song titles or the topic matters combined with the beauty. A lot of times these bands will incorporate different influences. A lot of folk metal bands take hints from black metal. Sayor is a good example of that. And a lot of folk metal is very digestible, very cleanly sung, and even though you do get into some of the black metal bands that take more of a harsh approach with folk metal, most of the time they're very pretty and they're very beautiful. Not particularly one of my favorite genres, but I know a lot of people that do enjoy it. Pirate metal. It's folk metal but pirate. It's sea shanty music. Elstorm. Go check out Elstorm. If you want a pirate metal band, Elstorm is like the most well-known and pretty much the only one that's had a lasting impact. It's gimmicky. It's very gimmicky. You want to know something else that's very gimmicky? Viking Metal. I'll shout out Amon Amarth for this one. Viking Metal is black metal or death metal, but usually black metal that is gimmicky for Vikings. It doesn't really change the style, it just makes it sound like a war anthem half the time, similar to how pirate metal just makes it sound like a sea shanty. And then post metal. Post metal has been included in so many genres, and I've mentioned it in this video quite a few times. Agalok, Cult of Luna, Neurosis, as well as bands like Pelican and Isis. Post metal is expansive, awe-inspiring, experimental at times, long tracks, very atmospheric. It's usually not abrasive and will have soundscapes that are massive, layered, drenched in reverb, cleanly produced. And if you want metal music that evokes an experience, a lot of these bands don't have vocalists and are just instrumentally led, which really lets it take the forefront if you want like good background music or something to feel cerebral with, because a lot of them are very smartly written, but a lot of them do have vocalists and combine it with anything from death growls to clean singing. It's a pretty wide genre. But that's that. There it is, the encyclopedia of metal genres and explanations in bands. Holy crap! What are your guys' thoughts of these? What is your favorite metal genre? Thank you so much for watching this video if you're still here. I appreciate it so much. I cannot believe I did this undertaking, but I'm proud of myself and I wanted to do this video and I'm glad I did. Comment down below what you thought about this video. I can't wait to hear it. Like this video if you enjoyed it, subscribe to join the review family today, and smash that notification bell to be notified of my future uploads. You know who it is. My name is Jay Morris, and I'm signing off saying farewell.